Hi everyone, my name is Rachel Marks and I'm the Director of Education here at SunRay. We help thousands of general contractors, subcontractors, and suppliers secure their lien and bond claim rights. SunRay secures over $10 billion annually. Today's webinar is conducted by the incredible Kevin Estevez, an Arizona construction lien law guru. Today's webinar topic is Arizona lien waivers. Be careful with what you sign. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the fabulous Kevin Estevez.
Thank you, Rachel. Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning to those of you on the West Coast. Like Rachel said, my name is Kevin Estevez, and I'm going to be talking about Arizona lien waivers. And with that, we'll jump right into it. So welcome to the webinar. If you have any questions, please use the chat box on the right side of your screen, and we will hold all the questions to the end. And at that point, we will answer any questions that you may have, and do not include company names or individual names in the questions, please. So what we're going to cover today, briefly, are lien waivers in Arizona generally. Then we're going to talk about an overview of the 4 specific forms of lien waivers used in Arizona. And then we're going to end with lien waivers, do's and don'ts. So in Arizona, lien waivers are creatures of statute, specifically ARS 33-1008 identifies the types and forms of lien waivers that may be used in Arizona. In fact, must be used in Arizona. And they are as follows. We have a conditional waiver and release on progress payment, an unconditional waiver and release on progress payment, a conditional waiver and release on final payment, and an unconditional waiver and release on final payment. Now, the waivers that are used that do not substantially follow the statutory forms contained in the statute I just referenced are unenforceable. So it's important, and we'll cover this in the do's and don'ts, to make sure that you're signing a statutorily compliant lien waiver. But the key word here, and an important distinction, is that the statute requires that the forms substantially follow what's in the statute. And that doesn't mean that statutory forms cannot be modified in any way. And in fact, there may be times, we can talk about those a little bit later, where you may want to slightly modify one of the statutory forms. Again, it should still substantially follow what's in the statute, but there are circumstances when modifications may be necessary. So let's talk first about progress waivers versus final waivers, and that's one of the 2 distinctions in the forms of waivers that we're going to talk about here today. Progress waivers are used when a lien claimant is required to execute a waiver and release in exchange for or in order to induce the payment of a progress payment. And generally, these only release lien rights for a specific period of time. And when you're reviewing a progress waiver, be sure that you are signing the right type of progress waiver, whether it be a conditional or unconditional. We can talk about that here in a second. The second type of waiver that we're addressing here are final waivers, and these are used when a lien claimant is required to execute a waiver and release in exchange for or in order to induce payment of a final payment. And these generally release all lien rights on a project. And again, as with progress waivers, be sure you are using the right type of final waiver, whether it be a conditional or unconditional. And we'll talk about those on the next slide. But that's the distinction, generally speaking, between progress and final waivers in Arizona. Now let's talk about conditional waivers versus unconditional waivers. Conditional waivers are used when a lien claimant is required to execute a waiver and release in exchange for in order to induce payment, and the claimant is not in fact paid in exchange for the waiver and release, or a single payee check or joint payee check is given in exchange for the waiver and release. So generally speaking, these are only effective if a payment if the payment identified in the waiver is made. And the general rule of thumb in Arizona is you have a conditional waiver plus a subsequent payment, and that payment clearing equals an unconditional waiver to the extent of the payment. So as I said in the slide a second ago, we were talking about progress versus final waivers. When we're dealing with conditional versus unconditional, you want to make sure you're, and specifically conditional waivers, we want to make sure that we're signing the right type of conditional waiver, either progress or final, as the condition warrants. And that brings us to unconditional waivers. And these are used when a lien claimant is required to execute a waiver and release in exchange for an order to induce payment, and the claimant asserts in the waiver that it has been paid the payment. And these are effective, generally speaking, even if the payment identified in the waiver is not made. So as with all the other types of waivers that we've talked about here, if you're signing an unconditional waiver, you want to be sure that you are signing the right type, either progress or final, when it comes to unconditional waivers. And we'll talk about this more in the do's and don'ts, but one of the big things, and it's an issue that unfortunately is quite common in the industry, where you'll have parties demanding signing unconditional waivers, either progress or final, in exchange for delivery of a check. And under our statutes, that should not be done, because you get in a situation where, and you'll see this in the forms of the waiver, where the unconditional waiver says that you've received payment and that payment's good and you're signing off on that. And you can waive your lien rights, even if you don't receive the payment, or the payment ends up not being good. So it's real important with unconditional waivers to make sure that you've received the payment and that payment has cleared before you sign that form. So next slide here, this is the statutory form that is located in ARS 33-1008 D1 for unconditional waiver and release on progress payment. And so I've highlighted here in this statutory form some of the critical language, and we'll start with on receipt by the undersigned of a check. So it's saying once that check is received, and then further on down here, and when the check has been properly endorsed and has been paid by the bank on which it is drawn. So those are the prerequisites to this conditional waiver becoming effective, is the receipt of a check and the check becoming properly endorsed by the bank on which it is drawn. In that circumstance, the conditional waiver and release on progress payment will then, skipping down to the next highlighted section, release claims for all labor, services, or equipment furnished to the job site through the date on which is provided in that conditional waiver only, and does not cover any retention, pending modifications, and changes or items furnished after that date. So with respect to conditional waivers in Arizona, you want to be really careful with the through date that you're providing. You don't want to shoot too far in the forward and too far forward in the future, and maybe unintentionally release lien rights for work that is performed in the future, hasn't yet been performed. Next, we have the unconditional waiver and release on progress payment. And this is located in 33-1008 D2. And so you can see what is provided here in the very first sentence is the undersigned has been paid and has received a progress payment in the sum of, and you fill in the amount there. And so that's the distinction between the conditional and unconditional, is with the unconditional, you're representing that you have been paid and you've received that amount. And then if you skip down to the next highlighted section here, what we have is language saying that, again, this distinguishes as a progress waiver, and it provides that through date. So it's waiving unconditionally lien rights through the date that's included there, only and does not cover any retention pending modification and changes or items furnished after that date. And the last important part here of the unconditional waiver and release on progress payments is this notice on the bottom, which is required by statute, and it's something that bears warning and careful consideration. And it's that this document waives rights unconditionally and states that you have been paid for giving up those rights. This document is enforceable against you if you sign it, even if you have not been paid. If you have not been paid, use a conditional release form. So again, really important that if you're receiving the check at the same time, you receive, if you're being asked to furnish a unconditional waiver in exchange for a check or before a check clears, if you furnish that waiver and something happens, you don't get the check or the check doesn't go through, there's an argument based on the statutory language, a quite strong one, that you've waived your lien rights. So be careful, don't sign unconditional waivers until payment's been received and it has cleared. The next form that we're going to talk about briefly is the conditional waiver and release on final payment. And this is in 1008 D3. And this is, so like the conditional waiver and release on progress payment, this again says on receipt by the undersign of a check, and when the check has been properly endorsed and has been paid by the bank on which it's drawn, effectively this conditional waiver becomes effective. And again, the adage for lien math in Arizona is a conditional waiver plus a payment equals an unconditional to the extent of that payment. But this, as opposed to the progress waivers, if you look at the next highlighted section I have here, it says this release covers the final payment to the undersigned for all labor, services, equipment, or materials furnished to the job site, except for disputed claims in the amount of X. So whereas the progress waivers were waiving lien rights through a certain period of time, this is waiving lien rights as to all labor and services and equipment furnished to the project, except for any carve out of disputed claims that are mentioned. And finally, the fourth and final type of lien waiver provided for in Arizona statutes is the unconditional waiver and release on final payment. And this is located in ARS 33-1008 D4. And like the conditional waiver and release on progress payment, this, because it's a unconditional waiver, says the undersigned has been paid in full for labor, services, equipment, or materials furnished to the job site. So again, it's representing that payment has already been received, and that's part and parcel with an unconditional waiver. And it does have that exception that is also set forth in the conditional final waiver for disputed claims or extra work. So you want to, if there are disputed claims or extra work, you want to make sure you include those before you sign this unconditional final waiver. And again, as with the unconditional progress waiver, you have this language here at the bottom that says that this waives rights unconditionally and states that you've paid for giving up those rights, and this document is enforceable even if you have not been paid. So again, if you sign this without having received payment first, or in exchange for a check, and something happens with that payment, you have waived your lien rights on the project according to the statutory form here. So again, unconditional waivers are something to be very, very careful with. So that gets us through the forms of lien waivers provided for by Arizona statutes, and that brings us to our section here that talks about lien waiver do's and don'ts. So first, lien waiver do exercise extreme caution when you're executing any lien waiver. If you are executing a waiver that is a progress waiver, either unconditional or conditional, you want to make sure you're very careful with the through date on the waiver. If you're signing a final waiver, you want to make sure that you're very careful with that, filling in claims for disputed work or extra sums. And you want to be our second do is to be sure that you sign the right type of and a statutory compliant waiver. So again, if you're dealing with progress payments, you want to make sure if it's a situation that warrants a conditional progress waiver, that's what you're signing. If it's a situation that warrants an unconditional progress waiver, that's what you're signing. And the same thing with both the unconditional and conditional final waivers, and then as between progress and final waivers, you want to make sure that you're signing the right one of those. With respect to the time period covered by progress waivers, you want to be really sure, and like I said a second ago, you want to be sure that you are paying attention to those. So our third do is be mindful of the time period covered by a progress waiver. And where you can potentially run into situations is, the example that sometimes rears its ugly head is on a project where you have a progress waiver submitted with a payment application, a conditional progress waiver, and for whatever reason, there's a dispute over that payment, and money's held back and payments aren't received. And then so say that's the August pay application for purposes of our example, and then September rolls around and you've done more work on the project or you furnish more materials, and in that circumstance you submit a September pay application. Well, that September pay application, if you're not careful, you may provide a conditional progress waiver that has a through date, through the work done in September, and you don't have any carve out for the fact that you haven't been paid for the work that was done in August. And if you got payment for that September waiver and you've waived lien rights through that certain day on that date on the project in September, you're going to have a problem for that unpaid work in August. So in certain circumstances, you got to be careful with through dates, and that may be one of the circumstances where you may want to modify the waiver that you're furnishing, because you can get into a real issue of waiver in that circumstance. And our last do with respect to lien waivers in Arizona is seek legal assistance before you sign a lien waiver if you are all uncertain. If your gut feeling is telling you, hey, there may be an issue here, that's the time you want to go seek legal assistance before you sign something and potentially and maybe unwittingly waive lien rights. That moves us on to lien waiver don'ts. And I've said this several times throughout today's talk. Don't sign unconditional lien waivers until you receive payment and that payment has cleared. The second one is don't unintentionally waive lien rights in connection with progress payments, and that gets us to the issue that I just talked about before, where you may unwittingly waive lien rights because you submit a conditional or unconditional in connection with one progress payment application, but you maybe didn't get paid for work that had preceded that. So be very, very, very careful in those circumstances. And then our last lien waiver don't neglect to include dispute amounts in final waivers. If you sign a final waiver, whether it's an unconditional or a conditional, and you have disputes or you have claims for extra work and you don't reflect those in the waiver, you have waived rights to seek those amounts. So that language and that specific carve out in both the unconditional and conditional final waiver forms for disputed claims and extra work is there for a reason, and it should be used. And that brings us to the conclusion of our presentation today. As a reminder, Arizona statutes and case law relating to the construction industry are full of detailed technical requirements and exceptions, and this presentation cannot substitute for specific legal advice. If you have any questions or concerns relating to any aspects of mechanics liens or lien waivers, please consult a qualified attorney. And with that, we can open it up to questions if there are any.
First and foremost, I just want to say thank you so much, Kevin, for your time today and educating us on this important topic of lien waivers. You provided us with super helpful information. This was a very, very detailed webinar, so thank you for that. Right now, I do not see any questions that have come through. However, if anyone does think of a question after the webinar, please feel free to reach out to myself or Kevin, and we will make sure to answer any questions that you may have. If you'll go to the next slide for me, please.
Sure.
Okay, so if you guys would like to take a moment to review us on Google, we would appreciate that. And then if you go to the next slide, Kevin. Okay, so let's talk about our next upcoming webinar with Kevin. This will be on October 24th, same time, 12 to 12:20 Eastern Standard Time. The title will be Getting Paid Faster with Liens, Bonds, and Contracts. So go ahead and register for free at sunraynotice.com/education. And the next slide. And that's all that we have for you today. So thank you so much for everyone who joined us. And I hope everyone has a sunny day, and we hope to see you on our next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.